A postcard from the small hours drifts in with the hush of the room, the monitor dimmed, the night outside folded and kind. I steady my voice, and together we look toward a quiet visitor crossing the sun's pale outskirts. Nothing urgent here, no alarms, only a slow, even light that asks to be watched without hurry. You can settle however is most comfortable, shoulders easy, jaw unclenched. If it helps, slip on headphones and let your phone rest in Do Not Disturb. I'll keep the pace soft and the edges rounded. We are here for gentle science, the kind that opens like a low tide and leaves the sand smooth behind it. Our guest has travelled a long way, older than our calendars and calmer than headlines would suggest. I will speak of it with care. We'll notice its brightness the way one notices night air by a window, without pushing, without naming too quickly. When the mind tries to sprint, we will invite it to walk. When the story leans toward drama, we will turn it back toward measure. If you like this kind of listening, there's a playlist where these quiet explorations gather, a small harbour to return to when you want familiar waves. You're welcome there, always. For now, let the room be the room, and let the sky be the sky. We begin with patience, and we keep it. That is enough to start. Begin with the eye. Let it idle on a soft field of stars, the kind that arrive as dusted pinpricks and then resolve into steadier points the longer we look. I trace a slow path from one quiet anchor to another, across a lane of velvet and low shimmer, until a dim traveller sits at the edge of attention. It is not dramatic. It does not shout. A faint haze surrounds it like a quiet halo, and I let your gaze rest there while my voice keeps the room unhurried. Light is a patient teacher. Watch how the star points hold fast as our guest shifts just a little between frames, a whisper of motion across the background. That is all detection needs sometimes. 2 moments, one after the other, and a careful subtraction of yesterday from tonight. Surveys do this by habit, capturing sky swaths again and again, comparing them gently and letting the moving speck declare itself without any fanfare. Now the eye narrows. The glow around the core feels soft, as if the surface is waking into sunlight it has not felt in an age. When cold ices meet warmth, they give off gas and fine dust. The cloud that forms is not an atmosphere in the way a planet keeps air. It is a temporary veil that rides with the nucleus and thickens or thins with distance from the sun. We do not need equations for this moment. We only need to keep watching the way a night fisher watches the line for a quiet tug. A second line of sight opens, the path it takes. Some paths loop and return. This one will not. You and I will speak more about that later, but for now, it's enough to hold the idea of a road that bends inward and then back outward, open to space, not captive to it. The naming for such roads is tidy and useful, yet I prefer tonight's slower language. It comes in simple pieces, closer, warmer, brighter, then farther, cooler, dimmer, and each piece eases the mind toward rest. Another look at brightness. A barely there change, then another, mapped night after night by small circles with shuttered domes and quiet computers humming through their tasks. Photometry is a soft craft at heart. Measure the light, correct for the air, compare to standards, draw a line through the scatter, and ask what the line might mean. A rising trend can hint at gentle activity, a wavering one can hint at rotation. None of this requires suspense. It asks for patience, for repeated glances, for a willingness to be content with a curve that grows one slow tick at a time. Safety is simple to say, and good to hear. This visitor keeps its distance. Coordinators who guard our planet's well-being look for different signatures entirely. Tight approaches, tiny uncertainties that swell into concern, patterns that call for precise modeling and careful alerts. That is not our story tonight. Our story is the low hum of cooperation, survey fields picked up, time booked at larger mirrors, spectra taken in the near-infrared and in the visible, notes filed and shared. And within that hum sits our quiet halo, changing just enough to reward another look tomorrow, steady enough to invite sleep tonight. Because somewhere inside that glow is the tale of where it formed, and how it holds its dust. Told not as a warning, but as a lullaby of chemistry and light that repeats with the patience of tides across black sand, the kind you can hear more than you can name, the kind that returns whether or not we keep count of the hours. I guide the eye one last time across the field, from the halo to a nearby star and back, the way you might trace the edge of a page before closing a book. The glow does not insist. It offers a color that is almost grey, almost blue, a tone that slips toward cooler as the night deepens. We can let that tone carry us, slow and even, into the next quiet part of the story, where the road widens and the sky thins its light by degrees, until the pale dissolves into something gentler still. The night begins with a tick. A shutter closes, a shutter opens, and the camera's heart counts silence into frames. I match my breath to that patient metronome as the survey sweeps a broad lane of sky, panel by panel, like bars of quiet music laid end to end. The computers listen with their own calm attention. They prefer repetition. 2 frames, then 2 more, each separated by a small pause, each sounding the same rhythm so that a moving speck will break the pattern, the way a single offbeat tells you a new instrument has joined the song. Pixels speak in whispers. A field arrives, faint and even, and the pipeline lowers the room's noise, subtracting bias, taming dark current, smoothing the soft hiss of background glow. Against a reference image from an earlier night, the algorithm performs a careful subtraction. Cosmic rays crackle and are dismissed. Hot pixels hiss and are muted. A straight, bright scrape from a satellite is clipped and set aside. What remains after this listening lesson is a small, steady residue that shifts between frames with the tempo of an object, not a flaw. The software suggests it. A human confirms it. The log accepts another quiet line. Now the cadence widens from camera to network. I send astrometry like tiny chimes, timestamp, coordinates, brightness, and the code of the station that heard it. The Minor Planet Center gathers these notes into a score, compares them with reports from other long ears on other ridgelines, and issues a bulletin that amounts to a soft, "We hear it too." I read those lines aloud in a near whisper, and you can almost sense the dome fans lower their volume in response, as if the building itself were making room for this small voice to carry. A pause, then the math listens in. Fresh points feed a simple fit, and the first orbit sketch hums from the speaker, rough at the edges, uncertain in its tempo, yet already telling us whether the path loops or opens. With more measures added, the uncertainty narrows. Least squares routines adjust in gentle increments, one residual at a time, shaving off noise the way a careful technician trims a buzz from a signal. I sit with the comfort of this process. It has no appetite for drama. It likes long arcs, honest errors, and the discipline of admitting what we cannot yet resolve. If a small outward push appears in the data later, the models will make a place for it as a non-gravitational term, quiet as a breath added to the mix. Halfway through the night, the beat changes colourless, but clear. A larger mirror begins to listen, trading breadth for depth. The slit slides into position with a subdued click, and the spectrograph spreads the light into a spectrum the way a microphone separates chords into individual tones, so that faint bands from familiar molecules can be heard not as rumours, but as notes. CN's small edge, the longer hum of carbon monoxide, the thin, higher thread of reflected sunlight shaped by dust. And while the graph traces these lines across the screen, a low compressor purr blends with the clock of the shutter. And in that layered sound, the work finds its own lullaby. A steady proof that careful hearing can turn a smudge into a voice, and a voice into a composition that tells us about temperature, about grain size, about gases that stir earlier than water, all without raising the volume beyond what a resting mind can hold. The room keeps time. A high fan murmurs. The dome's bearings drone like a distant roadway hidden behind weather. I let a full minute pass in that sound alone, a still interval where no new fact needs to arrive, and the apparatus themselves provide the company. Somewhere outside, the wind changes key against the walls. Inside, the cadence remains even. Follow-up requests move along this pulse. Subaru listens from one ocean. The VLT listens from another. Each has its own local rhythm, guiders that chirp, controllers that tick, status lamps that blink at a human pace so the operators can feel the progress rather than chase it. I write a short proposal in this same tempo, asking for a spectrum at high resolution and a handful of deeper images to refine the path. There is no scramble, only a queue with many good reasons inside it, and our candidate earns a place among them because interstellar guests are rare and, when caught, offer harmonics we do not usually hear. I return to the survey screens to keep the count. The pipeline flags more frames, and I watch for false positives the way an engineer listens for ground loops in an audio line, those shallow, repeating hums that do not belong. Airplanes make their sharp stutters. Satellites leave scoops that are too straight, too swift. The object we want keeps its beat, small, consistent, and patient. We enter a few more measurements, and the orbit tightens further, shaving away the wobble that early arcs always carry. I imagine the models as noise-cancelling headphones. They reduce the clutter, not by pretending it isn't there, but by subtracting what they have already learned about it, leaving the signal in a softer relief that the ear can follow without strain. Near morning, the spectrograph room settles into a murmur low enough to feel like a blanket. The spectrum is faint, yet it functions as promised. There are no surprises in its key, only the comfort of hearing that this guest behaves like a natural object warmed into activity, at a distance where certain ices volunteer first. I copy the plot into the log and add a line on the safe geometry of the path, a line on the next window we might request, a line on the calm we intend to keep. Let the devices do the loud work. Let our voices stay soft. The night's last exposure opens, and we leave the chapter on the same shared beat that carried us through it. The spectrograph ticks once. What makes a traveller interstellar? A small answer first. The road they follow never loops back. The curve is open. It bends near the sun, like a courteous bow, then continues outward forever, a path that does not belong to our neighborhood. I hold that image and let it breathe, because in the quiet of a long night, the idea itself is soothing. Some guests arrive and some keep going, and we listen as they pass. Names help us keep company on the road. When a trajectory proves unbound, the designation carries an eye for Interstellar, a simple mile marker that tells any sky watcher what kind of journey this is. The math behind it centers on eccentricity, a measure of how stretched an orbit is. Bound paths, ellipses, live under the number 1. Parabolas brush that value at the edge. Hyperbolas step cleanly over it. If the number is greater than 1, the road is open and our guest is passing through, not settling in. Speed, too, has its waypoints. Far from the sun's pull, a traveller keeps a leftover pace called hyperbolic excess. A steady cruise you can imagine as the speed the road keeps even after the hills fall away. Precedent helps. The first noted visitor, nicknamed Oumuamua, glided in with a surplus of roughly the mid-20s in kilometers per second. The second, Borisov, was faster still, in the low 30s. Those are useful mileposts, not trophies. I speak them quietly, so they land as context and not as contest. Our current guest will have its own number, refined by better arcs and calmer nights, but the story shape is the same. In from afar, around the lamp once, then outward again with a pace that gravity nudges but does not keep. There is a turning point on every route. For a sun-skirting traveller, that point is perihelion, the closest approach where the curve tightens before relaxing again. Warmth peaks there. Activity often rises. Afterward the long coast begins, outward into the cooler dark. This geometry is ordinary and kind. It does not imply a crisis. The caretakers who watch for hazards look for tight crossings with Earth's own lane, for uncertainties that could swell into risk. That is not our corridor tonight. The open road we follow does not cut across our doorstep, and the modelers who keep the traffic maps have said as much, which means you can let your breath settle and imagine the swing as a graceful turn taken well within the lines. Why care, then, about a road that does not return? Because roads carry cargo, and this one carries chemistry from a place we did not build. Grains and ices formed under a different sun take a single lap through our light. And in that slow pass we can read a little of their packing list. The volatiles that wake first, the dust that reflects softly, the patterns that emerge when warmth touches a surface that may not have felt a star in a very long time. And if some of those ingredients resemble the simple organics seen in familiar comets, the idea that basic molecules move between systems becomes less a guess and more a gentle picture of a galaxy where materials wander, knock once on many doors, and then drift on. The map we draw for such a traveller is compact. A handful of elements sketch the route: semi-major axis, eccentricity, inclination, argument of perihelion, and the place where the path crosses our plane. We collect measurements night after night and tie them into that frame, never pretending the early versions are final. The uncertainties shrink like distance markers coming into focus through a windshield fogged with sleep. Sometimes, when gases slip from the surface, tiny pushes lean the path by a hair. Models make room for that with quiet terms that do not break the road, only sand its edges. The work feels like walking. Beside someone at night and matching their stride, no hurry in it, only a shared pace and a shared direction. knowing that at a certain corner they will continue down their avenue and we will turn toward home. I think of the open road again, of the courtesy it asks. We will watch without gripping, curious but unforced, content to let numbers do their calming work while our attention stays soft. There will be more light curves, more spectra, more small corrections as the arc grows. Enough to keep the story honest, not enough to disturb the room. And if the road holds open, as the math says it should, then the traveller will lift back into the wider dark with its cargo measured and its presence folded into our log like a postcard filed by date. If the glow keeps this pace, where will it rest next? A single minute opens like a postcard at the edge of night, the kind you keep between pages to remember a harbour at calm tide. Monitors glow with softened blues and creams, and the log waits for the next line. I picture the sky as an inlet, and our guest as a small vessel gliding along a slow current, slipping past beacons that blink at unhurried intervals, each light a quiet confirmation that the channel is clear. Before any facts arrive, let the room pour its own sea. The air moves with a gentle draft from the vents. Paper settles with a faint, dry sigh. Somewhere a kettle clicks and forgets its heat. A swiveling chair whispers across the floor like a wave, change in its mind before it breaks. Farther away, footsteps approach, pause, and turn back, and two low voices trade a few syllables that never try to be a conversation. Instruments idle with their hums braided together, not pushing, not receding, only keeping a level tide against the walls while the night breathes and the screens wait. Requests begin their passage, the way boats slip from berth to channel. I draft a short note to the sky's busiest ship, the one with eyes tuned for the cool glow that stirs when distant ices wake, and another to an elder in higher orbits whose crisp gaze still reads the visible bands with patient clarity. Programs exist for sudden needs, little gates that open when a target matters more because it will not linger. Even those gates honor cue and weather and the balance of many voyages at once. A proposal is a map, not a flare. It marks a route, a time window, a reason to drift close and look, and it floats downstream to a committee that treats attention as a precious current to be shared. Coordinating across water and shore takes a quiet choreography. While a mirror on a high desert listens for fine structure in the coma and tracks how the cloud leans with phase, a colder instrument far above can listen for the notes that ride beyond red, where dust softens sunlight and certain gases confess themselves by narrow lines. And in those minutes when both are aimed together, one tracing shape and one tracing composition, we get a tide chart of behavior, a paired record of how the halo expands, while the spectrum braids its faint signatures, and the two streams of information nest into one another until the path that seemed abstract by geometry alone begins to feel like a route with real currents and depth changes that our models can follow without strain. The value of catching those minutes together lives in gentle increments. A small rise in brightness aligns with a trace in the cooler bands, and the pairing turns a guess into a story of early stirring. If the glow steadies while the lines stay thin, rotation may be the hand on the tiller rather than fresh outgassing. If both swell in step, activity is the likelier tide. None of this wants the noisy surf of hurried claims. It wants charts, overlapping and dated, the way mariners compare soundings taken at slack water against soundings taken at flood, penciling differences and letting the page turn to a record instead of a forecast. The logs themselves are part of this voyage. Each entry is a buoy hammered into place along the channel, marking time, pointing left or right, asking nothing but to be seen and trusted. On another coastline, a large mirror will trade depth for resolution and read the same light with a different grain, and the two notes will meet in a shared ledger. We do not demand perfection of weather, or of machines, or of ourselves. We ask only that the path be traced with enough care to tell us whether the traveller's wake is driven by steady wind or by brief gusts from its own deck, because the answer shapes how we'll meet the next guest and the next, choosing our harbours, tuning our instruments, and leaving the world outside this room as quiet as we found it. A final look at the inlet brings the card to its edge. The screens dim slightly. A cursor blinks like a distant buoy that will not tire. I write the new line with an even hand and set the pen down. At the appointed minute, the room remembers how to breathe. The room builds its own weather. A low rush from the vents moves around the ceiling, soft as a tide of conditioned air that never breaks. Cables give off their faint plastic scent. A fan turns a lazy circle in the corner and keeps a steady hush. I let that hush set the measure, and for a while we listen to nothing in particular, because nothing in particular is where the drift begins. Not all winds are air. The sun sends a stream instead, charged particles moving through the heliosphere, thin as a ghost and constant enough to matter over distance. When that stream meets what a cold surface releases, it treats the gases like a pale haze and carries them outward, shaping them without touch. I imagine it as a field that never raises its voice, changing direction now and then with the sun's magnetic mood, but always present, always leaning on what it finds. The sound of our room becomes a stand-in. The low blower hum maps to that steady flow. The tiny whir of a guidance motor suggests the turn of a field line. The slight click of a relay becomes a marker of change that most nights barely registers. Closer in the data, the difference between tails hushes into view. Dust, once freed, lingers and curves, pushed by light itself, its finer grains swept faster, its heavier bits lazing behind. I think of it as a soft plume that remembers where it came from. Ions, by contrast, obey the stream and split away in a clean, narrow wisp, pointing almost straight from the sun, thin and precise. Under certain lights, those ions sing in recognizable ways, the bright, cold signatures of familiar molecules that instruments have learned to hear. None of that needs to trouble the mind with hard edges tonight. It can settle on the simple image, one haze that bends and one that runs like a single quiet thread. Activity that begins early tells a gentle story. Some ices volunteer at lower warmth, carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide among them, and a traveller rich in those ingredients can form a veil while it is still far from the sun's stronger heat. The veil is not a permanent coat. It thickens with daylight, thins with distance, and sometimes pulses when a seam opens or a patch catches a quick dose of warmth and releases a breath. In the log, that breath appears as a small brightening, the kind that makes observers look again the next night, the kind that rewards patience rather than craving a momentary show. Our pace fits that rhythm. Slow checks, even notes, a line now, another later. No threat sits in this soundscape. The people who watch for close passes listen to different alarms than these. They model tight encounters, track the width of uncertainties, and prepare polite signals for when those uncertainties grow. What we follow here is a distant hush, important for what it can teach about chemistry and dust and drift, not for any changes it could bring to our days. The room's calm is honest. This is study, not warning, and the steadiness suits the night. Spectra add their own tone to the mix, so soft you might miss the melody on a crowded day. But in the quiet it stands out, a line here and a line there, long enough in integration to gather a fragile signal, then stacked and compared, so that what begins as rumour turns into a whisper we can trust. And while the plot grows with patient pixels, the rest of the building holds its breath. The electronics breathing a measured heat into their housings, the dome tracing a slow arc that you feel more than hear. And in that layered stillness, the veil we picture stops being guesswork and becomes a traceable thing. Molecules carried like mist by a stream that has flowed since before our calendars, dust pushed gently by light that has crossed space to find a surface that has not felt such warmth in a very long time. I spend a minute doing almost nothing. The lights stay low. The fan keeps its round, even exhale. Somewhere a cable settles with a soft tap against the rack, and then the tone that all empty rooms have, a barely audible floor of noise, fills the gaps between every other sound. That floor is not silence, yet it does the work of silence, making a place where thought can slow and still be awake. One by one, the tiny ticks that mark time feel less like counts and more like the room's own breath. The drift grows soft and wide. The veil holds together, moving as one. A few last notes shape the edge. The stream carries on, invisible and tireless. The faint plume answers when warmed. The graphs will collect these replies and lay them out as a calm record for later, when brighter rooms and daylight minds will read them closely. For now, the lab becomes a low instrument of its own. The vent hush, the motor's trace, the easy click of a relay, a long, even breath from the building. A low hush settles between instruments, a slow breathing of metal and night. Begin at the smallest edge, where a single speck loosens from the surface and meets sunlight like a thread, leaving the loom. It drifts a finger's width from the nucleus, closer than any camera can truly resolve, then feels a gentle tug that does not stop. Gravity asks the grain to stay in the warp of the sun's pull. Light urges it along a new weft, and the compromise is a curved path that traces a tidy stitch behind the traveller. Larger fragments keep to a tighter seam. Finer dust lifts easily and lays a wider arc. In that embroidery of motion, each grain remembers both the star that calls and the brightness that pushes, and the pattern we see is not noise, but cloth being made in front of us, a patient textile of dust and light that unfurls with no hurry at all. Step half a pace back, and the physics shows its hem. Photons arrive one after another, small and countless, and their summed push acts like a steady hand drawing the thread outward. Dynamicists describe the balance with a simple ratio: how hard the light presses compared with how hard gravity holds. And from that number flows the shape of the stitch. Tighter for heavier grains, looser for soot-like flecks. The scattering of sunlight from those grains colours the cloth's sheen. Forward scatter brightens the side facing the sun. Back scatter dims another angle, and phase changes add their quiet moire to our images. What we log as a tale is not a flag in wind, but a two-material weave, particle sizes distributing themselves by pressure and time until the curve reads like fabric draped from an unseen pin. Now widen the frame until the background comes into view. The path of the whole visitor threads across a coordinate cloth we share, the fixed grid astronomers call J2000, marked by nodes and angles that tell where the route pierces our plane and how steeply it tilts from it. Inclination becomes a measured slant in the weave. Argument of perihelion is where the stitch turns closest to the sun's bright selvage. The open curve itself is cut from a hyperbolic pattern, not a loop, so the fabric never closes on itself here. We align nightly points along that pattern and watch the residuals fall as the seam straightens. None of this requires rush. It rewards repetition, the way running a thumb along a seam reveals snags by feel long before the eye can see them. Planets, large and far, tug at the cloth as well, but, in our case, their pulls are mild ripples rather than rips. Jupiter and Saturn are like heavy bobbins resting beneath the tapestry. Their weight shapes the overall sag of the fabric, yet a small thread passing briefly overhead is not caught or cut. Numerical models stitch those background influences into the route. Tiny tilts here, minor pacing there, so that what remains after the major drape is accounted for are the finer textures we care about tonight. The safe geometry we follow is a path laid clear across the larger rug, distant from the thick knots where close approaches live. You can feel that clearance the way you sense space on a quiet stair. There is room enough to move without brushing the rail. Sometimes a faint extra nudge appears in the data, and then we test an added stitch. Outgassing can act like a soft seamstress, pulling on the nucleus with little repeated tugs that add up across weeks, and our fits make room for that by allowing gentle turns in the radial and sideways directions. This is not a showy correction, but the kind of adjustment a careful hand makes when the fabric begins to pucker, smoothing with one pass, checking the lay and smoothing again, because the lesson from earlier work, most famously the measured non-gravitational drift in the first interstellar visitor, is that small forces do accumulate, and when we acknowledge them, the pattern becomes calmer. The uncertainties tuck in their loose ends, and the whole piece lies flatter against the frame we trust. Close again on the field we started with, the grain now lost to the cloth it helped define. The tail holds its curve, the path keeps its measured tilt, and the nightly points land closer to the line that our patient thread has traced. We will keep sewing data to model to sky, until the joined pieces lie smooth enough for quiet sleep, and with the stitch now visible, we pause. If the traveller carries more carbon monoxide than water ice close to its surface, then faint sunlight along the outer road is already enough to start a slow release, and a veil builds long before most comets would stir. If the blend leans toward carbon dioxide, the story is similar. Another early turn on the route, another soft sign that volatiles with lower warmth thresholds have stepped into motion. In either case, we aren't dealing in drama. We are reading mileposts. A small rise in brightness here, a slightly thicker haze there. The easy turn of a guest that begins its activity earlier on the path, because that is the nature of what rides under its crust, and not because anything urgent has changed in the lanes we share. Then the road gains company. Gas drifts outward, Dust joins it in a loose convoy, and the coma expands like a lay-by where travellers slow but do not stop. The pressure of light nudges fine grains into longer detours. Heavier grains keep closer to the centre line. Spectra sketch the passengers. A hint of CN, where the near-violet is most revealing. A muted whisper of CO, if the instruments are given enough time and the sky cooperates. Photometry keeps the odometer. It writes down each modest increase and asks only whether the slope is steady or stepped, whether the curve carries a rhythm that suggests rotation or a push that suggests fresher outgassing. None of this requires more than patience and a good map of the night. If rotation leaves its imprint, then the light curve will rise and fall with a calm periodicity, a wheel turning under the carriage that keeps its pace despite small bumps. If activity is the stronger cause, the curve will trend upward in a way rotation alone cannot mimic, and the coma's edge will look different in successive images taken at the same phase angle. We compare like with like. We let a few nights pass and see whether the pattern repeats on the same segment of the route. When it does, rotation has the reins. When it does not, we look for gas that joined the journey more recently, perhaps from a patch that faced the sun a little longer, or from a seam that opened as thermal stress crept along the path. Then, the message moves outward along the road network that astronomers share. A minor planet center. Circular posts fresh coordinates and an improved path. An IAU notice summarizes the lane's shape and the openness of its curve. A handful of observatories adjust their waypoints and request windows where clear weather and clear scheduling might align. No sirens, just soft signals that another rest stop on the campaign has opened, that a spectrum is worth taking at this mileage marker, that a deeper image should be aligned with a specific phase, so the comparison is cleaner later. The language in these notes stays measured, the way a good road sign gives direction without commentary. If tiny, steady pushes appear in the orbit fits, then we test a non-gravitational term and see if the residuals settle, the way a driver eases a hand on the wheel to keep the car centered when a crosswind picks up on a long highway. If the fit does not improve, we remove the term and keep driving, content with the gravitational route alone. Models are companions here, not bosses. They remind us when the lane is drifting, and they accept correction when the evidence returns us to the median. Over the next stretch, the uncertainties narrow. The open curve stays open. The easy turn, already paced in our earlier notes, becomes easier still. Then, if a brief outburst flashes, like a roadside camera catching a brighter instant, we do not chase it beyond its mile. We mark the place, we repeat the measurement, and we let the next night confirm or quiet the event. And if the rise is real, we fold it into a picture that stays modest, because a single bright patch is not a detour from the journey, but a local hill the traveller has crossed. A reminder that surfaces are uneven, and schedules are not promises, and we keep the convoy moving at the speed of data, not the speed of rumour, because nothing about a long, clean pass is improved by haste, or by the theatrical language that often rushes in from roads we are not driving tonight, and nothing about a good observation is harmed by leaving it in its lane until the map is sharper and the turns are named with care. Then we let the room take the lead again. Fans breathe. A shutter blinks. The distant night presses softly at the windows without asking to be let in. I rest the pen on the log where the last line ends, and I let a long, even minute pass while the instruments keep their tempo. That is enough for now. Tonight I lay 3 handrails across the path, 3 steady threads to hold as we cross a long, quiet bridge. The first is position measured well. The second is brightness measured kindly. The third is colour measured patiently. Woven together, they keep our footing sure. Pulled apart, they invite stumbles. We will keep them braided, not tight, not slack, only enough to guide the hands. Handrail 1, astrometry, the cloth of wear. Each dot on the frame is a stitch tied to a time, and the distance from model to dot, the residual, tells us whether the seam is lined flat. When points cluster with even spacing and small scatter, the fabric behaves. When a few points tug outward in one direction night after night, we test whether a faint extra pull is at work. The test is not a verdict. It is a gentle pin added to the pattern to see if the puckers ease. If they do, the fit smooths. If they do not, we pull the pin and let the cloth relax again. Numbers can crowd the mind when they arrive too fast. Here, they arrive like stitches counted under breath, and we only ask whether the weave feels even from fingertip to fingertip. Handrail 2, photometry, the cloth of how bright. No single measurement speaks for the whole garment. Air thickens and thins. The angle between sun, visitor, and earth changes the sheen. We correct gently for those tilts so that a rise belongs to the source rather than to the spotlight. Then we look for rhythm in the line, a drift that repeats, a crest that returns on the same interval. And if that rhythm holds across several nights at similar viewing, rotation may be the shuttle passing back and forth beneath the loom, steady and independent of mood. If, instead, the line climbs beyond what rotation would produce, we call it activity's thread. Thinner at first, then more sure, as similar slopes appear under like conditions. Either way, the handrail keeps us from mistaking a trick of light for a change in the fabric itself. Handrail 3, spectrum, the cloth of what? Spread the light and you see fibres. A slender band near the violet adds its own whisper. A pale structure in the blue hints at ions in motion. Deeper into the cool, a soft rise tells how dust holds warmth and returns it. None of these are loud colours. They are the muted tones of a well-worn shawl, familiar to anyone who has studied comets long enough to trust that simple molecules announce themselves with shy clarity, and that oxygen's green flicker, when present, is more a fringe than the garment. With time, these threads braid into a palette that feels consistent with a natural surface waking to sunlight at a gentle distance, not a showpiece, not a warning, only a proof that chemistry travels the way cloth carries scent, lightly and for long. Together, the 3 handrails limit invention. When position is smooth, brightness trends are easier to read. When brightness is honest, lines in the spectrum find their proper weight. When lines agree with the trend, position tests for little nudges become more meaningful. The braid gains strength as each strand supports the others, and speculation has fewer places to snag. If a rumour tries to tug, the cloth resists because the weave is already holding across many crossings, and because earlier comets taught us to trust the interplay. Wide-field images to see the drape, careful light curves to watch the fall of the hem, and spectra to name the threads. In that slow, repeating work, a long sentence of proof writes itself across many nights, and the reader is not one person, but a roomful of quiet eyes comparing notes until the fabric of agreement is stronger than any single claim that tried to run ahead of the loom. Let me gather the handrails in one palm so you can feel their texture. Here is the where. Points that land close to the expected path and shrink their scatter as the arc grows. Here is the how bright. Magnitudes adjusted for angle and air, forming a line that sways a little with rotation and leans upward with warmth. Here is the what. Lines and curves that tell of dust and gases that stir before water takes the lead, nearer in. Hold them together for a breath. They are not heavy. They sit like soft cords against the skin, easy to keep, easier still to drop if the mind grows tired. But kept in hand, they assure you that what we say about this traveller is anchored to the cloth that the sky itself is weaving in real time, and that our story moves no faster than that weave can bear. So the night proceeds on a braided thread. A few more measurements arrive and slip into place with little protest. Someone at another telescope adds a point to the ledger. Someone else posts a spectrum with a hint that agrees more than it surprises. We nod without raising our voices. The three handrails continue to do their work, quiet and sturdy. If they change, we will feel the change through the braid, rather than from a single unruly strand. And that is the comfort of method, that it keeps our steps on the bridge and our gaze on the path, not on the drop, while the river slips by beneath with its own soft tempo, and follow a single hue tonight. A pale green trace slips along the edge of the coma, not bright enough to call attention to itself, yet sure enough to guide the eyes. I keep that colour in front of us the way one keeps a candle steady in a dim hall. No flourish, no rush, only a quiet line of light that says, here is where the story breathes. Green can mean many things in space, but here it is not a stormy curtain or a planet's crown. It is the soft signature of atoms set free from simple molecules, lifted into a brief higher state by sunlight, then falling and giving back a tiny thread of glow. The effect is local, patient, and shy. You won't see it from a backyard without help. You will feel it, though, once the spectrum separates the chorus into voices, and the green strand holds its pitch from one night to the next. Other colours answer and keep the palette honest. Near the violet sits a band that often marks a fragment from more complex chemistry, faint as chalk dust, useful as a landmark. In the bluer lanes, ions carry their own neat pattern, a quick, ordered ripple that tends to appear when a tail is thin and well-behaved in the solar wind. Deeper out toward the cool, the light bends toward warmth kept by dust and release slowly, a low ember under ash. I let these shades gather without crowding each other, because each says something small and true. And the truth grows best when the room is quiet enough to hear one tone at a time. Let the ambience settle here. Screens dim to a pewter wash. A status light blinks the gentlest emerald, steady as a resting pulse. A paper scrap on the console reflects a muted glow, then forgets it, and goes matte again. Somewhere in the building, a door eases against its frame and does not latch. The air carries the faintest light of the city back to us, barely there, as if the horizon had learned to breathe. For a minute, no graphs move. The colour waits and does not fade. Colour is a translator between confusion and calm. Green in this case speaks of sunlight working on released fragments, not of a planet's sky, not of a magnetized glow far above us. The violet whisper speaks of a family of molecules that often ride with dust, but show themselves best when the line is cool and the night holds steady. Blue structures tell of charged species obedient to the larger field, a tidy geometry that points away from the sun with the sort of discipline only a current can provide. And the warmer rise, slow and broad, traces grains that keep the day's light a little longer before giving it back as evening. Taken together, these colours do not compete. They concur, and their agreement is a soft reassurance that our guest behaves like a natural traveller, warmed at distance, unhurried in its answers, generous in its quiet. The most tender part of all this is how little light we need to learn something real. A narrow band teased from the background, a faint step in a brightness curve, a thread-like ion feature that stays aligned through the week, and then the way each piece points toward the others until a small, sturdy picture forms. One in which distant ices can begin to stir before water takes charge nearer in, one in which dust sizes write their brightness rules in reflection rather than proclamation, and one in which a thin glow that many would miss entirely becomes, for those who linger, a calm and dependable sign that physics is keeping its promises while the night does what nights do, which is to offer time enough for care and never insist on more than patience. Under that palette, instruments keep the cadence, but not the spotlight. A high-resolution spectrograph listens for the exact shapes of the lines. A spaceborne eye listens where heat speaks more clearly. A wide mirror on Earth watches texture, while the others listen for tone. None of them needs to win. They trade turns gently, and when their results meet in a shared log, the colours align. The green where it should be, the violet where expected, the blue signatures behaving, the long cool slope matching the dust. And in that alignment, the temptation to inflate falls away, because what matters is not one dramatic frame, but many modest ones, layered until the whole is simple to trust. I return to the pale green trace and hold it still. It does not surge. It does not declare. It keeps a soft margin around the nucleus and reminds us that low, steady processes write most of the universe's stories, and that our job on a night like this is to let the palette unfold at its own speed. We'll add another exposure, another line, another careful comparison. We'll let a colleague's spectrum rest next to ours. We will describe the glow without borrowing the language of spectacle. And in doing so, we will leave room for sleep to arrive without missing anything essential, because essential things in astronomy almost always shine softly first and only grow loud when gathered together across time. The green thins toward a paler blue, almost a lullaby. We take a slow walk along the chart. Step by step, I trace the plotted wake as it curves inward, touches the sun's bright road, and leans back toward the open water. Nothing rushes us here. The symbols on the paper breathe at a human pace, and I read them aloud as if they were small buoys set to guide a night crossing. Inclination comes first, the chart's quiet way of telling us how steeply this track tilts against the plane most traffic uses. Picture the ecliptic as a broad shipping lane where planets keep to familiar routes. Our guest approaches on a higher or lower swell, crossing that lane cleanly, but without merging. The ascending node marks the point where the track climbs from the far side of the plane to the near side, a neat buoy placed where the wake threads through the main channel. There is comfort in these marks. They turn a distant path into a readable waterway, free of romance, yet generous with clarity. I slide my finger to the symbols that describe the swing at closest approach. Argument of perihelion is the way the chart notes which bearing the vessel takes as it rounds the inner marker, a direction written in angles rather than compass words. Past that turn, the curve opens again. Ellipses make loops and promise returns. Hyperbolas open their arms and do not close, and that is the shape on our page tonight. The paper does not raise its voice about it. It simply holds the arc and lets us see that this is a passage through, not a circuit within, the harbour of our star. Clearance matters on any crossing. Mariners speak of underkeel depth. In the sky, we speak of distances between lanes. MOID, the minimum orbit intersection distance, is the chart's way of asking how close two routes could come, if timing lined up exactly. When MOID is large, the lanes are well separated, and no careful pilot would be asked to change course. When MOID is small, attention grows, models refine, and notices are posted. For our walk tonight, the separation is broad and polite. The planets keep their traffic, and the visitor keeps its track with the sort of spacing that makes every watchstander breathe easier, and every line in the log sound more like routine than alert. There is talk sometimes of passing near Mars, as any long arc might appear to do from certain angles. In a calm reading of the chart, near means safe water, a wide berth, no crossing signals, no tugboats called from their slips. A path that looks tight in a flat projection relaxes when the tilt and timing are accounted for, and what remains is a respectful distance that suits a quiet voyage. Models fold in the background pulls from the great planets, much as a harbour pilot notes tides and residual swell. They bend the track slightly. They do not drive it from its lane. Outbound after the turn, the vessel resumes its set and drift, and what will remain far from the sun's pull, its hyperbolic excess, is simply the speed a current keeps once the lighthouse is a memory, and the open sea has taken back the horizon, a number that persists not by drama, but by design, because gravity's grip weakens with distance, while the road beyond remains wide and untroubled by shoal or wall. I fold the paper once and let the weight of it settle in my hand. The elements, tilt, nodes, the bearing at the inner mark, work together like lights along a jetty that do not seek attention, but provide it anyway. Each additional night adds a tiny correction, like repainting a buoy, so its green shows a little truer at dusk. And across those nights the uncertainties narrow, not to perfection, but to a lane that any cautious captain would accept without fuss. There is no rumour on the chart, only the firm kindness of measured space between tracks, and the understanding that a vessel from far water can pass through our roads without calling for anything more than a few extra eyes and a clean copy of the harbour plan. We could walk faster. We won't. Better to match the chart's gait and feel how the path leans as it leaves the lighthouse behind, how the plotted dots fall in a line that gives confidence to the next watch, how the outbound margin widens as the current becomes the only hand on the keel. And with those felt assurances gathered, we pause at the harbour mouth, just inside the breakwater, where the night air cools and the paper rests under my palm like a well-used map that knows the doorway of the sea and asks us not to step through it yet. This is a letter meant for the quiet part of your night. I'm writing from a room where the lights are low and the instruments keep their soft routines, and I am thinking of you, of your shoulders settling, and your breath finding an easy depth. Let the mind move like the morning fog across a meadow, present, unhurried, touching everything lightly without needing to name it all. I'm here to hold the pace while you drift. We won't force anything to clear before it's ready. The story is still the story when it arrives through a veil. First, thank you for staying with this slow science. There is comfort in knowing that attention can be gentle and still be true. Our visitor remains a distant guest. It is not a signal, not a warning, not a reason to brace. The guards who listen for footsteps, we must answer quickly. Those caretakers have different dashboards and different bells, and their maps light up only when lanes tighten. That is not tonight. We are reading a calm page and noting a quiet change in brightness where the cold begins to lift. The rest is air we do not need to push aside. Language is the weather inside a room. When we say open path rather than escape, the pressure drops a little. When we say early activity rather than mystery, the fog lifts without the wind. I try to choose words that match the physics and respect your rest. An interstellar object is a traveler on a curve that doesn't close here. A coma is a temporary haze, not an atmosphere. Brightening is a line, not a flare. Why invite thunder when a soft cloud will carry the same truth more faithfully? Words can startle. They can also soothe. Tonight, we let them be drizzle on glass, the kind you hear more than you see, the kind that slows a town without stopping it. I want you to know, too, that a long chain of listeners stands between noise and news. Survey cameras make their even rounds. Observers at larger mirrors take turns, file their spectra, and send notes in a tone designed to be calm first and clear always. The people who coordinate public messages are practiced in turning difficult details into sentences that travel gently, and I appreciate that care, because a good sentence can be a soft hand on the shoulder when a headline tries to sprint. We do not need to rehearse alarms. We need to carry accurate light through mist, so that anyone walking behind us can see the path without squinting. If you're listening with the room dimmed, it may help to set small boundaries that keep the hush intact. Put the device down where its glow feels more like dew than glare. Let your phone rest in quiet mode so the night keeps its shape. Breathe in the slow count that feels natural to you. Pause, then let it go with a simple thought. We're not racing this story, we're walking it. The mind can stand in a field for a while and let the fog lift by itself. That is still movement. That is still learning. The veil thins when it is ready, not when we tug. I will keep my tone even while we touch a few landmarks again. Others have passed this way with no harm done, quiet postcards from beyond our star. The current guest also keeps its courteous distance, and that is why our attention can be so tender. We have time to be precise without being urgent, to test small pushes in the path without imagining storms that are not there, to compare light curves with spectra and let pattern become understanding. And as the campaign continues, more rooms like this one will add their lines to the ledger, and each line will arrive with the same patient rhythm because the work is built to hold a steady breath, even when the sky gives us more to watch than to say. And even when many hands are at the logbook, the handwriting remains measured, so no single flourish distracts from the page we share. There is a comfort in the way coordination itself moves through a mist, quietly, consistently, without needing center stage, surveys passing their stitched positions to a clearinghouse that was made for patience. Orbit calculators treating uncertainty like a fog bank that thins from its edges, rather than like a wall to be smashed through. Larger instruments waiting for windows that open with weather and geometry, while public-facing teams remind everyone that a distant, unbound traveller is a chance to learn, not a reason to harden the jaw. And all of that, taken together, is how a community keeps faith with both accuracy and calm, because the fog is not an enemy. It is a medium we can learn to live with, and when we do, our words and measurements leave just enough trail for those who come after us to navigate with care. So, this letter closes as softly as it began. Our guest goes on being a small haze in a large sky. Our questions keep their kind edges. We add to the log without hurry, and we keep our voices at the level of a private note passed across a quiet room. If sleep has found you, let it keep you. If you're still drifting, you can let your shoulders drop here. The sky does too. The lab at night is a quilt of low lights and quiet tasks, every screen stitched into the room's soft geometry. A red lamp hems the doorway. A pale monitor binds the far wall in a gentle rectangle. I rest a notebook where the bench feels worn smooth, and the pen lays its line like thread skimming cotton. This is the hour when work turns to fabric, patient, methodical, each motion tied to the next with small, regular knots that hold. On the main display, plots hang like swatches pinned to a board. One shows brightness across nights, the weave of dots leaning upward by degrees. Another shows residuals, the tiny phrase where model and sky do not yet match. A spectrum panel looks like fine twill, faint bands repeating at measured intervals. I move between them the way a tailor checks seams, not rushing, not tugging, lifting each corner to see if light passes through and marking what needs one more pass with the iron of attention. Data hygiene is craft. We mend bias frames, baste flats against uneven illumination, and clip outliers, so a single wild stitch does not pucker the whole piece. Error bars are not decorations. They are selvages that keep edges true, reminders that even a good fabric can stretch if pulled too hard. When I type a note about a possible non-gravitational nudge, I set it like a basting stitch. Visible, provisional, easy to remove if the next night asks for a cleaner seam. The logbook grows with these careful additions, page by page becoming a stitched logbook, each entry matched to the last, with a consistency that invites sleep rather than spectacle. Mid-shift, I let the machines hum and give the room a minute to breathe. The ventilation moves a mild draft across the bench. A relay taps like knuckles on wood from far down the rack. One monitor cycles its brightness so slowly that only the corners fade, then return. I stand still and count the spacing between those fades. The building answers with its own textile of sounds, a thin whir under the consoles, a soft cushion of white hush where the air bends around a cabinet, a brief hush in the hallway as a door closes and leaves the weave unbroken again. Back at the board, comparison brings its calm. Two prior visitors set a standard hem. One was dust poor and needed careful stitching to keep the fit from sagging. The other carried a more generous pile and lay flat more easily. Our current piece falls between. Its texture shows early activity, but not exuberance. A hand that suggests fine, cool threads waking before thicker fibers of water take their turn nearer the sun. And in the overlap, where light curve, spectra, and orbit meet, the pattern settles into something we have handled before. Familiar enough that the next passes of needle and note can follow established lines without guessing at a new design. Tools on the horizon feel like looms being assembled in the next room. A southern survey, broad as a bolt of sky cloth, will sweep and re-sweep the visible field, catching motion in regular intervals so tiny shifts can be stitched into maps before they slip through the fingers. A patient spacecraft is being readied to wait, where the fabric of observation is already taut and clean, prepared to race a shuttle along a fresh thread as soon as a suitable visitor brushes the frame. Together, these tools promise fewer dropped stitches, more runs caught while they are small, and more chances for the community to bind a passing guest into a proper sample of measurements, rather than a handful of hurried patches that never quite align. I flip to a fresh page and write down tonight's small repairs. The photometry shows modest brightening with geometry accounted for. I note the method used for correcting angle and air so the next reader can follow the seam. The orbit fit accepts a light non-gravitational term for now. I flag it as temporary until a longer arc tightens the weave. The spectrum hints at familiar fibers, cyan's faint cross-grain, a suggestion of ions in the blue, but nothing that calls for a new stitch pattern, and certainly nothing that asks for bolder thread. And because the point of a stitched logbook is that anyone in the room on any night can pick up the same line and continue it without tearing, I describe the tempo of the work as much as the results, so the fabric of practice stays consistent even as the sky changes its motif. I think of the boundary the traveller will cross when it leaves the sun's cloth for the wider, thinner textile of the space between stars. Inside our star's bubble, the weave is dense with charged threads drifting outward. At the edge, the pattern changes, and beyond it, the fabric is older, colder, and looser. Our guest will move from tight, warm fibres to a broad, dark field where nothing pulls at its hem in quite the same way again. The glow will fade, the veil will thin. The seam of its path across our patch will remain in the log long after the cloth itself has forgotten the touch. Near shift's end, I close loops. I sew the night to the day to come. A request for another image in a matching filter. A note for a colleague about an exposure time that kept the noise polite. A gentle suggestion that if the residuals stay even, we can relax the non-grav term and let the simpler fit hold for a while. And then I write down the pace we will keep. No faster than needed, no slower than helpful, because the stride of a good project is part of its pattern, and the pattern is what lets us hand off the fabric without stressing any seam. The last keystroke lands, crisp but soft, and in the glow that follows, I feel the room loosen its shoulders with me, as if the building itself had been carrying the bolt, and can now lay it flat for the next pair of hands. The lab at night is honest about what it can do. Take thin threads of light, align them, bind them, and hand them forward with edges squared and corners quiet. And when the doors open to morning and the halls fill with brighter steps, the cloth will look plain to anyone who didn't see it made, yet it will hold better than something flashier. Because patience sat at every seam, because the stitched logbook kept the pattern true, and because the people who share this work treat each entry as a stitch that joins rather than a flourish that shows. I set the pen down, feel the fabric under my palm cool and even, and let the night hand itself to the day. We've walked softly beside a small haze in a wide sky, and the room kept its even breath, while the instruments stitched their quiet record. The path we followed is open, not a loop, and that alone tells us our guest belongs to another neighborhood. Light and dust made a veil. Early, gentle activity likely came from cooler ices before waters turned nearer in. Spectra added shy color, enough to guide our hands without asking for headlines. Astrometry did its steady work, drawing the curve as the arc grew, and the fit settled into clarity with patience rather than speed. Nothing in this visit asked for alarm. Planetary Defense Watch's different corridors. This was a chance to practice care, to compare night with night, to let photometry and spectra agree, to test small pushes and keep or remove them without fuss. The conversation stretched across domes and desks through routine notices and calm proposals, and together those notes formed the measured fabric of a campaign built to last longer than any single frame. If you are drifting now, you can let this part fade like the last glow on a chart, left open under a dim lamp. The traveller will round its closest point, brighten a little, and then thin again as it leaves the sun's cloth for the broader dark. Logs will remain. Lessons will travel to the next guest. The sky is generous that way. Thank you for listening with such easy patience. May your night be quiet, your sleep unbroken, and your thoughts as orderly as a clean page. Good night.